and welcome to the DIF 2017. My name is Gilli. I work at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and today is joining me some of my colleagues. So the DIF is the online festival of ideas where we ask the question, what if we could redesign everything? We have been hearing a lot about circular economy over these last 2.5 weeks. Now let's see how we speak about it within the foundation. And after that, we will talk about how we apply it in the built-in environment. So joining me today is Joe Miller, my colleague who works in the higher education programs at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Ian Banks, who work for the editorial team. Thank you for joining me here. Let's start with Ian. Ian, you work in the editorial team, which means that you are in charge of the written content, what comes out of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, what goes out to the wider audience. I have picked up some texts that you might have written on the website. Let's have a look at that to start with. So, the circular economy is a concept that distinguishes between technical and biological cycles. The circular economy is a continuous positive development cycle. It preserves and enhances natural capital, optimizes resource yields, and minimizes system risk by managing finite stocks and renewable flows. A circular economy works effectively at every scale. Ian, did you really write this?
No hiding from that, Ian.
To be honest, I can't take full credit for that, though I should probably take some responsibility for it. We now have a new version of how to say this. Because yeah, we do have had some feedback to say that it's a little bit impenetrable. Another way maybe of explaining that would be to take a look at how a circular economy is different from the economy that we have at the moment, which is, in its essence, linear. So, we take materials out of the ground, we make them into things, we use them, and then we throw them away again.
So that's what we typically call the take, make, and dispose model. Is that right?
Exactly. Take, make, dispose. And in a circular economy, we would look to loop materials, but also products and the components within products. So as to design out waste, or the concept of waste, and also pollution.
Is it something that looks a bit more like this?
This is a newer expression of the principles behind circular economy we've been working on, which hopefully is a bit more straightforward. The idea is not to dumb these things down too much. So sort of hopefully there's some intriguing ideas. So we probably want to find a middle ground between the sort of ultra intricate and the sort of childishly simple. But so yeah, if you look at these ones, then to design out waste and pollution would be to. So I suppose maybe the trap that maybe certain sustainability approaches have taken in the past is to look at the economic system as it is and try and sort of mitigate, reduce the sort of negative impacts that might have, be they environmental or social, but not to actually design out those negative impacts from the start. So you would look to design an economy, a system, or a product that would just by its very nature would not lead to pollution, for example.
I think what's exciting about what Ian's saying is that the Foundation's definition or explanation of the circular economy is evolving, and I think that's always been the case right from the beginning. That we've got an idea, we've got a story, and that's going to develop. And if we sort of look back at when the Foundation started, 2010, there was something like 300 references to the circular economy on the website. There are now over 8 million on Google alone. So it's gaining momentum and traction. But what that means to different people, I think, is different things. And certainly within the Foundation, our thinking hasn't stopped just with some of the original ideas that Ian was mentioning, but we've evolved. But I think one of the ways in which I see it as something that we have retained a certain element of the circular economy is that for me, it's applying contemporary science to the economy. And that's not as scary as it sounds. So, you know, by contemporary science, I mean complex systems, complex adaptive systems, the way that nature works. Again, it's not that scary. We've all done the nutrient cycle at school. You know, we know how things work and how things stay within the loop and how they feed each other, and there's no waste in that system. And by the economy, I mean the whole economy. So not just the monetized economy that we think about when we talk about the economy, but the non-monetized aspects of the economy. So it's the social aspects, the environment, because they're all really important parts of a productive economy, and they always have been. As Ian said, this is really in contrast to the linear economy, which is based on previous science, which is very mechanistic, very linear, take, make, dispose, a throughput where materials are taken out of the ground, and it's a very much a consumption-based economy.
You talk about economy, but in those three principles, I don't actually see the word economy in that. Those three principles wouldn't work with the current linear economy. Why is that?
So they wouldn't work with the current linear economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you, I suppose, you know, I mean, to apply this sort of thinking, then it has to work economically. It has to be beneficial to people and to companies. And I mean, we've done work that shows that, you know, if you apply these principles, for example, if you have some sort of durable good, like, well, we've done washing machines. You could look at your iPad, or, you know, if you say, well, you know, there's a lot of finite materials in these things, you know, there's probably gold and tantalum and various other sort of rare earth metals and steel and everything else. If you set up a system where you don't build these things and sell them, and then once they're finished with, you might recycle a few materials or basically chuck them away. If you lease them or use some other sort of form of products as a service model, then basically you need to build fewer of them, and therefore you have cost savings in the materials that you're using. And those savings can be passed on partly to the manufacturer, so it becomes more profitable for them, but also partly to the consumer, to the user. It becomes cheaper for them to use it. So you have this sort of economic surplus that can be shared out between these two groups to make it beneficial to both. So it works.
Yeah, I think remanufacturing is often something that we talk about in the circular economy as being a loop, a flow, which can create value, particularly within the technical cycle. And just building on what
you mentioned, the technical cycle. Could we use that technical cycle applied to something a bit concrete? So you were mentioning the Ecovative example, and I think you have brought
that's
something
actually
about
something.
it.
Yeah, well, that's actually something that is more in the biological cycle. But I'm really quite happy to move on to that. I was going to just build on the technical cycle. Should I mention the biological cycle?
Well, I think, wouldn't that be part of the technical cycle? It could have a use that is reused within the different loops of packaging. Right. So just what is that we have on the table?
I've got something quite exciting here actually, which is called Ecovative, and I'll give you a bit there, Ian, to fondle. There you go, nice. Camille. Yeah, so Ecovative is a bio-based material, which is it's a packaging material. It's created from using mycelium roots, which you get in mushrooms, to grow packaging. So it takes agricultural feedstock that you can't use for anything else, and the mycelium roots bind that together. And it doesn't use any water or any light, so incredible minimal energy there. In fact, no energy at all to create something which really rivals packaging in the petrochemical plastics business like that.
Packaging typically for shipping something?
Shipping fragile things like bottles or something very fragile. But what's great about it is that, and this way is where it does fit straight into the biological cycle, is that it's completely compostable. So when you've finished with it, you can compost it, but not just simply it disappears, but in actual fact, it adds nutrients. So it's actually adding value. And I think that's what's different about the circular economy is when it takes insight. Yes, we can feed the plants. Yes,
that's
absolutely.
What I was thinking.
Let's feed the plants. is that you're building capital. So when I say taking insights from living systems, that's how a forest works. You know, a forest isn't just what you see above the ground. It's not just the big trees, but it's all about the effective flows of distributing the vital nutrients that happen underneath the soil. There's a whole kind of world under there, really. And in the same way, the biological cycle does that. It helps to build biological capital. So it's building ecological capital by feeding that plant, for example.
Okay, Jo, I'll just interrupt you here. You mentioned technical cycle and biological cycle. Let's put it into a visual diagram. This is the famous Ellen MacArthur Foundation diagram, which does in blue explain the technical cycle and in green the biological cycle. Is there some example? So you've just mentioned the biological cycle. Do you have an example?
So that would sort of fit in here, as it were.
Perfect.
The
what about the blue side of the diagram?
So in the blue side of the diagram, this is more about. So this is, I mean, we've sort of analogy to an insight from living systems. We've talked about, forests, but forests don't have laptops. They don't have,
No.
Fibres and things like that. They don't have things that we have. So we've sort of taken that as an insight, and it's about, on this side, it's about keeping the products, components and materials in the system through good design. So designing for, and keeping them at the highest utility as possible.
A car, for example, would fit in this?
A car, for example, would fit in that, and all the constituent parts of a car. So the car fits within the system, but how do you retain the value of that system and that car and stop it leaking out of the system? So an example is around remanufacturing, for example. There is Renault have a remanufacturing facility in Choisy in France, for example, which is the most profitable of all of their factories. They're able to produce products for their cars at 30 to 50% less price, less cost, with the same warranty to the customer, but using 80% less water, 88% less energy, 92% fewer chemicals. They employ 300 staff more, so you've got that social element to that. They're protecting themselves against the geopolitical risk of resource depletion.
I would love to hear more about that Choisy example. Now, let's just hear about Rose first, who will tell us about what's coming up with the DIF. And after that, we will see how we can apply all of these principles that we've talked about in an actual practical manner for the built environment. So now let's hear about Rose, who will tell us what's coming up with the DIF.
Thanks, Camille. I'm really glad you showed us what those packaging little squares was, because I thought they were very odd-looking brownies to begin with. But anyway, as Camille said at the beginning, it is the penultimate day of the DIF 2017, and we've had a fantastic 3 weeks of discussion, knowledge sharing and learning. And with a day and I haven't got a watch on, but a day and a bit left. There's still lots more to look forward to. So right after this session at 4 p.m. at GMT, we've got Stop Buying, Start Living, the Subscribed Life, which I'm hoping is going to be talking about rental models and washing machines, so don't miss out on that one. And then coming up tomorrow, I am slightly biased as it is Unschool of Disruptive Design that are doing the last of their 4 sessions on post-disposable futures. So in this last session presented by Leila Ajaralu, who you might recognise from speaking at our annual summit just a few months ago, last summer, they will be setting down the challenge to try and get all 7.4 billion people across the world to go post-disposable. So that's definitely not one to miss at 4 p.m. tomorrow. And straight after that is 5 p.m. is the last session, or the last live studio session of the DIF. And right in here, I think Colin's actually sabotaged my slides. It seems to say DIF God Colin Webster. Okay, DIF God Colin Webster will be hosting the Disruptive Innovation Festival Grand Finale, which will start at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and they'll be looking at what's come across throughout the whole of the last 3 weeks of the DIF, and what themes have come up and what stars have been born. So be sure to tune into that. So for now, Camille, it's back to you.
Hey, Right, thank you very much, Rose. And as you've noticed, only one day left, but lots of things coming up still. We were talking about circular economy just earlier, and now let's see how we can apply it to the built environment. Surprise, we have a guest who have just swapped with another guest. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Gilli Hobbs, you work at the BRE. Can you tell us a bit more about your implication with applying circular economy to the built environment?
Yes, so it's great to be here. I work at BRE, which is a UK organisation working with the built environment, all aspects of the built environment. We've been doing work for many years on resource efficiency in buildings, so the construction phase, refurbishment, demolition. And it was quite exciting when the whole area of circular economy came into the fore, because actually it was talking about a lot of the things that we've been trying to push forward with for quite a few of those years. And it looking at the whole sort of economic aspect of resources within the built environment. Many of the 3 principles that were shown earlier, we've been trying to do many of those for the last 20 odd years, probably more than that. So, how do you reduce waste? How do you reduce the pollution caused by waste? But then really importantly, how do you sort of conserve the resources within the built environment, knowing that many of the products and the materials that are in buildings are actually going to come out of those buildings before their technical service lives are actually exhausted. So, obviously the best thing in terms of conserving the value of those products, for example, would be to be able to use them in new building applications or other industries, and there was, it's very difficult to actually get that to happen in reality. So we were quite fortunate in that, maybe 3 years ago, we got involved with a European project called Buildings as Material Banks, and we've been able.
This is what you were mentioning as Bambi project.
Yes, we called it the Bambi project, okay. But it's BAMB, so the BAM project. And it's a European project, so there's 15 partners, 7 different countries involved. It's actually been going for 2 years now. And we've been trying to really deal with some of the complexities that are surrounding transitioning from a linear economy to a circular economy, specifically relating to the built environment.
What does Bambi stand for?
So it stands for Buildings as Material Banks. So it took us quite a while to come up with that. But yeah, it works. Because that is basically what we're trying to, if we're looking at the buildings already here, in terms of what resources can we extract from the buildings that are already here. Because, the replacement percentages are quite low, actually, in terms of the infrastructure. But then we're really importantly looking to the future. So how do we develop buildings now that will actually act as resources for the future in the best possible way? And in order to do that, we're looking at a number of different areas. So we're looking at the products that are in buildings and what are they made of, and what are the procurement options that are associated with them, what are the end-of-life, refurbishment, remanufacture, reuse options that are associated with them. So that's, we're calling that material passports. Right. But then we're also looking at how are those products put into the built environment. So particularly looking at reversible building design. So how do you make sure you can extract the products from the built environment in a way that you can optimise whatever the best end of that building life option is for those products.
So Gilli, you talked about material passports and reversible buildings. Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples that have already been taking action at the moment, some concrete examples that are already out there?
Yeah, I think I've got a slide somewhere which it's actually an old example on the BRE site. It's building 16, where we actually use reclaimed bricks in the new construction. So this was 20 years ago, so it's actually, it's still innovative, which is quite depressing, to be honest, but it's a good example of where we use the reclaimed bricks, and this is just an illustration to say, well, actually, the embodied not all of it's come up. I don't know, there's bits missing, but anyway, this is an illustration of embodied carbon of the reclaimed bricks on the left versus the new bricks on the right. And this is just, this is one example of one building and one component within that building. what we're trying to do within the Bambi project is to really illustrate that before those decisions are taken, so that you can see that actually this is the environmental value you're creating by maybe considering a circular economy type solution. But then there are also the economic issues that need to be considered. So they need to be also, you know, available alongside this information, as well as the social impacts or values that are created by having buildings that may be more transformable, so they can last longer, so they can have the whole cultural heritage value. I mean, look at the building we're in here now. I mean, it's amazing. It's a really beautiful building, but it's been refurbished and repurposed to enable us to be sitting here now. And it just shows just the value that can be retained in terms of the, you know, the aesthetic value, but then there's also these other aspects of value. So what we're trying to do is really bring that out and provide it almost like as this, you know, this tripartite business case as to why you should be considering these alternative situations.
Passport sounds quite exciting.
Yeah.
What does that look like in reality?
I haven't got one with me. I thought I got my own passport
stamp it.
just in case I needed it on the ferry. But no, so I haven't got one with me. So it's a digital. It's predominantly it's digital information. You could potentially we can get to a situation where you can print them off and you can stick it on the wall somewhere. But actually, it's more about the transfer of information that is needed to help this decision making. Is needed to realise these optimal solutions. So, for example, you know, if there is a servicing arrangement as opposed to if you're leasing it rather than buying it, and actually there's regular maintenance that's required as part of that to enable you to then optimise the value at a certain replacement cycle, then that information needs to be captured somewhere, and a material passport could be a really good place to have that information available in a digital form that is then almost feeding into a building passport. I mean, we're not going to necessarily call it a building passport, but you know, that information is available within the building at the systems level, but all the way down to the component level.
So that when I might come along and I can sort of see all the various components and what they're made from, and perhaps what all the regulations are that they've passed, or how I can reuse it. And even when I come down to sort of 50 years down the line, when I want to perhaps take the building apart completely, I can understand what I can do with all those materials and where the embedded energy is, etc.
Ideally, that's the ideal situation. So, you know, these are the things that we're working on in terms of how do you transfer that information and retain that data integrity across potentially very long periods of time. But yeah, I mean, it could be that you could have you could have the information available but via scanning, as well as being available from the supplier website. I mean, construction product information is available digitally anyway, which is how we're moving towards that whole process in the construction sector, calling it building information modelling, where you can basically overlay lots of data on a 3D model of the building. And this is one aspect of data that could be available.
Gilli, what's the smallest element that has got a passport? So that there's a building materials passport, but I guess the parts of the building also have a passport. What's the smallest element that would have a passport? Is it a wall? Is it a door?
I mean, predominantly it's at component level. So it could be, you know, going back to this example, it could be the brick has a passport, and actually it'd be really useful to have that information at the point. You know, when we used those bricks 20 years ago, we knew where they came from because we went to the site, the original site of the building, and we got them from the demolition of the. You know, we knew the building they came from. So we did our own sort of quality assurance on our own audit trail. But actually the passport could do the same thing. So you could have that provenance information that would give you assurance that that product could be fit for purpose in certain applications, or if it isn't fit for purpose in the same application, it could then, you know, it could be really clear what other applications would be suitable for. And this is one of the barriers to reusing, particularly to reusing construction components or systems, is this risk. You know, what's the risk of reusing it? And actually, if you have the data, if you know who manufactured, when they manufactured it, what were the standards against which it performed at that period of time, what's its technical service life, how much of that technical service life has already been used. That gives you much better confidence to then say, well, actually, I now know what the best use is for this product or material. So it's about giving that data in a very structured format against these parameters that will actually facilitate this optimised resource use or product use in the future.
Do you think we are at a position now where we wouldn't be lost with all this data? Would we actually be able to make good use of whatever is contained within the material passport?
Yeah, well, it's as I say, it's more than just the material passport. It's also how the products have been put into the building. So that's the design information, as well as over the building life cycle. How has it been maintained? What's been refurbished? And then other design strategies that are relevant in terms of transformation capability. So we're bringing all of that together within the Bambi project, but then we're also trying it out on pilots, and I think that's where we're going to get, it's a real acid test to say, does this work in reality? And it's really exciting because we've got pilots all over Europe and they're prototyping, so we've got suppliers prototyping different types of connections, different systems, because they're trying to basically deliver these optimised solutions to deal with the circular economy.
Tell us about one of the pilots. What's your favourite?
Well, I suppose the one I really like is because I'm slightly obsessed with reclamation anyway. I have been for many years.
The one that goes around those yards, are you?
Yeah, I actually did. I did do part-time. I had a reclamation company with a friend of mine for a few years, but yeah, it got too complicated, so I went back to the day job. But yeah, I do love, and I think it's like the history, I mean, I love antiques and everything. It's almost like they're like mini history books, like the reclamation aspect is.
Gilli, can you just clarify what reclamation means? Is that refurbishment?
So I'm talking about reusing. So you could reuse a building, you could reuse a building system, like a facade system, or you can reuse a component, like a brick, use a brick as a brick again, as opposed to recycling, which is where you would take that same brick and you would crush it and use it as an aggregate replacement or a hardcore application. But going back to your question, which was the pilot, I mean, there's a pilot that it's called the Green Design Centre in Mostar in Bosnia, which in itself is like, it's a really interesting place. But it's like a really old school concrete building that's, on the verge, it's effectively a derelict building, huge, but we're going to basically, as part of the project, we're going to bring it back to, it's almost like a carcass, a building carcass, and then build this completely new, fantastic building on the carcass. So, a significant proportion of it will actually be an old building, and then we're going to put a new building onto it, effectively. But then that new building will have reversible building design, material passports. So it will be transformable, and then there'll be modules that can be taken out and used somewhere else completely. And then it's also going to be an innovation hub for the Mostar area. So it's basically going to transform this whole part of Mostar, and it's going to be one of the most interesting pilots in terms of the assessment processes that we're doing to do the environmental, economic, social assessment. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how the results come out on that particular example. But I know I'm going to get into trouble if I just say that's, the others are fantastic as well, but that's my favourite one.
Yeah.
Where can we learn about all these other examples? Is there a
so
website?
we have a website, which I haven't... So it's BAM. Have you got the leaflet? What's the leaflet? BAM 2020. I'm pretty sure it's BAM 2020.
It fell on the floor when I got excited over the equator earlier on.
And I think on the diff link, there's a nice video that basically summarises the BAM project, but then also has the web link, the Facebook link, and the Twitter handle on it. So, yeah.
Just to repeat, BAM is
so it's
part
BAM
of
2020. So it's been funded by the European Union. So
yes.
It's under the Horizon 2020 programme, and it's been going for about 2 years. There's another year left. We have a stakeholder network, so people can join the stakeholder network and come and join us we have various workshops throughout the year. And we're also looking for other pilots outside of the ones that are already going on. So if people want to get involved, you know, just get in touch really, join the network and then send us an email is probably the best way.
Obviously this is a research project which is really important to be able to understand kind of how this whole thing works and what the rationale is for it. So during your work on this, what are you finding some of the key barriers are with developers, for example, in terms of adopting some of these circular economy practices?
Well, I think in terms of trying to do new things, I mean, the construction project is very expensive, so the risk of things going wrong is always a factor. So if any sort of uncertainty as to that risk, so there's always going to be the question, well, what am I going to benefit? If I do new things and I increase my risk, what's the benefits associated with that? So that's one barrier, is that we don't have this real concrete information in terms of what the benefits are and the quantification of those benefits. And you can't just have a one-size-fits-all, because every project is going to be different in terms of its intended life cycle, the refurbishment cycles, the use cycles. So that in itself is quite a barrier, this sort of lack of knowledge in this space. But actually, you know, the thing that will drive it initially will be clients actually wanting to demonstrate the new scenarios, new circular scenarios within their projects. And I would think that in terms of who's most likely to do that, it's not going to be speculative development. It's much more likely to be where you've got an asset owner that's got this long-term association with the development. So maybe public sector or social housing, or maybe it's an enlightened private sector client who's going to actually manage their building for a long period of time.
Gilli, one question about the materials themselves. If, let's say, the passport of a building is a good one, what would be the materials in there? Is there a...
There isn't any right or wrong.
Okay.
And I would actually get shot if I suggested that there were good materials versus bad materials, because actually it's all very contextual. So, I don't think it's beneficial to say this material is better than that material, because actually, depending what the context is, it may be the best material or the best product for that job. So it's very contextual, and this is why, we have standards, and we have things like LCA, life cycle assessments, so that you can do those sorts of comparisons on a like-for-like basis within the same construction project. You can swap one product in and out, and then you can rerun the calculations, which is what we're trying to do in terms of circular building scenarios. But I think it's very contextual, so unfortunately, there's no right or wrong answer in terms of what you should be putting into your building. Probably avoid hazardous materials, I would suggest, is one. We're dealing with the consequences of issues from the past, like CFCs in installation and hazardous treatments for wood. So that's probably one area where, unless it's absolutely necessary for other performance objectives, the reduction of hazardous content is going to probably be a good thing to aim for.
And presumably the idea with product passports is that, and these material banks, is that the developers retain the ownership over those materials in the future, so that 50 years down, or even 10 years down the line, they've got that value that they can still keep. So it's another revenue stream for them. One of the questions that we often get asked at the foundation is around, if you're retaining the ownership of something, then isn't that a bad thing socially, for the kind of use of materials by others, perhaps?
I think there's different business models. I mean, that's one model that could work, particularly for shorter-lived products. So, for example, we have it in the flooring sector. You have refurbishment of carpet tiles, and you could easily have that as a contract whereby, you just wanted flooring. You weren't really bothered about owning the flooring, and then maybe there's the bit of the flooring which is most used can get taken out and replaced, and then you've still got the flooring that you require. And in that instance, it makes sense to retain the ownership. There's obviously the example of the lighting. There's a lighting example whereby the whole thing is packaged up. So there's an incentive to make the lights energy efficient, to make it maintainable, you know, refurbishable, repairable, etc.
So that means the building would need to be in some way modular. So we have a question from Jauko saying, what do you think about modular systems, modular constructions?
Well, as I say, I'm probably going to say the same as the previous question, which is very contextual. I think modular construction is obviously going to be very beneficial in some situations. You know, maybe where you're going to have, where you're going to need to sort of a certain bit of the building, like bathrooms. You can have modular bathrooms where everything has just been pre-assembled off-site, and you just plug it in, and then when that's maybe it's a temporary sort of building, or it's a shorter-lived building, and then that could be taken out and maybe used somewhere else, or it could be remanufactured or refurbished to be used somewhere else. So I definitely think modular construction has got advantages in terms of you know, having a sort of certain systemisation and standardisation. Hasn't necessarily happened yet, but it could happen in the future, where you have this standardisation which enables you to reduce waste, which enables you to incorporate products that can be disassembled, etc. So I think there is definitely a way forward in terms of modularisation and off-site fabrication that could be really beneficial to having optimised resource use in the future. But I think it has to be done with that in mind, because otherwise it's a modular system, and if you can't get it out without smashing it to pieces, then you're not going to be able to use it again. Yeah. So that's one issue actually that could be faced.
I was just wondering what sort of kind of conditions or things you think are going to help move this along more quickly. So you're talking about visionary developers, for example. Well, I suppose they're few and far between. You know, if there's the you know the hard reality is that they've got to make money. So are there other sort of aspects which are perhaps outside the control of developers that maybe need to be considered in parallel with some of the work that you're doing around materials banks, passports, etc.?
I think policy and regulation can obviously have a big impact, as it has in the energy sector. You know, the energy efficiency in buildings has been very much impacted by tightening regulations on what's the acceptable performance for energy in buildings, and it's revolutionised energy in buildings. So now, you know, buildings in a few years' time will effectively be zero carbon in terms of energy consumption. So legislation can have a key effect. What legislation may work in this particular situation is something that still hasn't been clarified. So part of the Bambi project is actually looking at policy and regulation and what sort of policies could facilitate transition alongside all the other things that are going on. So there are financial instruments. So, for example, you could make reused content could be cheaper because there's no VAT on it. That's one example. For example, you know, there are other things whereby you could maybe there's a Dutch policy that I think is really interesting, where they're looking at embodied carbon of new buildings and putting restrictions on embodied carbon of new buildings. So maybe that can then act as an incentive to say, well, you know, what are our strategies to reduce the embodied carbon of buildings? And that could in itself lend itself to incorporating more you know, resources that in themselves have a lower embodied carbon, which could include obviously reclaimed type materials and components.
Let us wrap up here. Gilli, thank you so much for sharing with us all of this information. It's been a really good session. I've really enjoyed this. So we've heard about the circular economy in the built environment. We've been mentioning the materials passport for buildings, the reversible building design, but also mentioning the principles of modular systems. We've heard about ways to reduce waste in the building environment, to share more resources, and the idea of having components, part of the buildings, as a service rather than being owned by the landlords. So thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for the other session. Goodbye.